Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. It's often said that history is written by the victors, but today many so-called victims are getting their chance to be heard. Some worry that America's rich historical tale is being replaced by a new story with America cast as the villain. Others say that we are simply including new voices in the ongoing dialogue of history. Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Daniel Boorstin, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, the Librarian of Congress Emeritus and author of The Discoverers; Eric Foner, Professor of History at Columbia University and author of A House Divided, America in the Age of Lincoln; James Horton, Professor of History at George Washington University and author of Free People of Color Inside the African American Community; and Robert Royal, Vice President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of 1492 and All That, The Political Manipulations of History. The question before this House: who owns history? This week on Think Tank. Playwright Oscar Wilde once said, "The one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it." Well, for some people, modern historians are fulfilling that duty a little too well. Today, instead of celebrating the anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, some people mourn. Columbus Day, they say, is a celebration of a genocidal invasion by white Europeans. 100 years ago, it was quite different. In 1892, Americans joyously celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. President Benjamin Harrison called him the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. Today, some historians call Columbus, plain and simple, a murderer. And Columbus isn't alone. Until recently, the founding fathers were larger-than-life, heroic figures. But over the last 30 years, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams have been depicted as greedy, sexist, and racist oppressors. American Indians, on the other hand, were often portrayed as savage and cruel, but Native American cultures have undergone considerable reappraisal. Nowadays, they are often pictured as peaceful people living in harmony with the natural environment. More recently, veterans groups objected to a planned exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution commemorating the 50th anniversary of the American bombing of Hiroshima. They claimed that the museum was rewriting history, portraying the Japanese as mere defenders of their culture against an imperialist America. The decision to use the atomic bomb in this version of history was an unnecessary and racist act. Eric Foner, let's begin with you and go around the room. Where do you come out on the Columbus question? Was he a great discoverer, or was he a murderer?
Columbus was a great discoverer, but I think that's the least interesting and important historical question that you can ask about him. I think what revisionists, if you want to call them that, are pointing out is that the historical developments set in motion or symbolized by Columbus's encounter with the New World produced both great good and great evil for different peoples in different parts of the world. And no account of that era is complete if it doesn't look at both sides of the question. So that's just the way history is written. It can't be celebration and it can't be victimization. It has to include, both of these perspectives at the same time.
James Horton?
I think it's an oversimplification if you wanted to pose the question as you have. Obviously, this is a person who is at the center of major change in human history. To that extent, he's tremendously important. But the change wasn't always good. And it wasn't always good for those people whom he, and I put this in quotes, discovered. So therefore, you got to look at Columbus and his coming to what he called the New World as a major historical event, but one that had ramifications that were both horrible and progressive.
Robert Royal, you buy that, what we've heard?
Well, I would put it this way. Where would we all be today if it wasn't for Columbus? We wouldn't be sitting here. I would make a much more forceful case for him, simply on these grounds, that insofar as there's been some revision of the picture of Columbus, I think that's all to the good, that all the truth we can get on the record is certainly welcome. But I'd be prepared to argue that there is not a single evil that the Europeans perpetrated in the New World that wasn't already here before Columbus arrived, with the possible exception of religious intolerance that I'm not sure about. It seems to me that the Incans were very vigorous in their attempts to convert other peoples as well. But I think that's the perspective we have to see it in. It isn't that Columbus has introduced something new into a pristine American environment. He brought along some evils with him from Europe, maybe exaggerated some that already existed here. But the result overall, I think, has been something quite remarkable and for the good for the human race.
Daniel Borston.
Well, I think there's a larger question, really, and that is our capacity to understand human nature. And I think that we should take this opportunity to celebrate the possibilities of human nature, which is what we do when we celebrate a hero. And I think Columbus was a hero because he had those qualities of human nature which are made for greatness, opening the world, bringing the world together, and showing courage, an ability to use the knowledge of his time, which he was well acquainted with, and applying it with the technology available to enlarge the experience and capacities of the human race. That bringing together was the great thing. And of course, every great act has a price. And I think in this country we're rather inclined to believe that we can have great things cost-free, but there are no discoveries which are cost-free. And this is just another example.
Why has our view of Columbus changed so much in recent years?
Well, as you pointed out at the beginning, previous views of Columbus were as one-sided as perhaps some of the critics in 1992 were guilty of being. 100 years ago, when there was the celebration of the 400th anniversary, Columbus was portrayed as an unalloyed hero producing pure good for humanity. The United States was the sort of onward march of progress and freedom for the world, and that was what history was. And it's natural that a one-dimensional point of view like that is going to eventually lead to revisionism and criticism.
I would say that you could regard the reaction to Columbus in 1992 as sort of a symptom of how we feel as a society. Columbus, in historical fact, was certainly not an ecological monster the way he was sometimes portrayed in 1992. He certainly did not practice racism or imperialism any more than many other peoples around the world and in the pre-Columbian Americas practiced. But all those are symptoms of some nervousness that we feel in our own society, and where we felt great confidence in 1892 and thought of ourselves as a forward-looking society. I think now our basic problem is that we know that we've lost something that we'd like to get back, and as we search for where we might find those bases, we look elsewhere. I think there's a lot of projection been carried out in trying to find in Native American cultures, for example, a kind of a pristine relationship to the environment that in fact historically did not exist. But that is not to say that the concern itself is not something that we ought to pay attention to.
One of the things that I guess I have trouble understanding is why people don't understand that there are a variety of points of views here. I mean, we'll never know what the history is. We'll never know when we have all the evidence in. We have different point of views, and we certainly ought to be able to understand that. I mean, after all, if you were an American Indian if you were an Arawak Indian standing on the shores watching Columbus come, and you knew that within 100 years you'd be extinct, in large part because this presence was coming, it seems to me that you would not be expected to see this as a new and progressive thing. On the other hand, if you were in Europe and you knew that this was going to expand your boundaries in the world, you certainly would see it as a new and progressive thing. I mean, what we're talking here are different points of views, and we certainly can understand that different points of views exist.
But I think it's, excuse me, Jim,
Sure.
but I think there is a spirit which is expressed in the revisionist insistence, which I don't find sympathetic, and that's what I would call the arrogance of modernity. It's always, it seemed to me, and it's one of the themes that I've played in my book, The Discoverers, which you were kind enough to mention, that the great obstacle to progress is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And I think that illusion is one that the revisionists are constantly expressing. They believe that they have the final answer to what virtue should be. And I think that one of the purposes of the study of history should be to open our minds to extend our thinking, to imagine that things can be otherwise. And one of the ways of being otherwise is that people could have wanted to do, that a great person, an inspired, courageous person, could have wanted to reach out across the world to reach the Indies as it had never been reached before.
Of course, there is bad history produced anywhere, you know, on all levels, revisionist, standard history, but the best of the new histories are actually forcing us to rethink the whole mainstream of American history.
That's the
they're
rubric
making
called
us
the new history.
Yes, they're
Isn't
making
it-
us think in new ways about they're not segregating themselves off. The challenge is we have to think in new ways about the American Revolution. We have to think of new ways about the Civil War. Once you incorporate the history of women or of African Americans or of other groups into
but in
that
what-
story, it's a different story then. That's the real challenge that the new history is
But
posing, and
shouldn't
that's why it is disturbing to some people.
Let me ask Dan Borston a question. Is this new history really new? I mean, I've read some of your works on America, and they get far afield from what merely presidents and the Congress have done. They get into the whole warp and woof of American society, which is what you're talking about. So what's new?
Well, I would, I hope my writing has done what you've suggested, but I think what we should aim at is a human history.
Absolutely.
And I think that insofar as the champions of different minority histories have set up their own departments and their own lectureships and courses, they have tended to divide history, to separate us from one another.
But can I interrupt here for a second?
Yeah.
Because those departments have not been set up because people said, geez, well, we ought to have a separate department. They've been set up because the history has not been included traditionally in what we have been told is American history.
Well,
I mean, for most of the teaching of American history has been the history of a tiny minority of Americans who generally are presidents, heads of corporations, and generals. There are only a very few Americans who have ever been that.
I
So
don't
the
know.
vast
Whom you
majority,
give me, mention a major historian of whom that's true. I can't think of one.
in terms of what history was about, for example, we have our Revolutionary era, our Jacksonian era, our Jeffersonian era, our Civil War era. Those eras take their name from great events or great, and this is not by accident, men. Now the point is that there were important things going on among the majority of Americans during that period, some of whom were black, some of whom were Indian, some of whom were poor, most of whom were women. The point is that if this history is not being included in the traditional telling of history, how are you to get it into the curriculum unless you do this in
I think what I would
a
call the
separate...
divisive or so-called minority approach, what Arthur Schlesinger calls the disuniting of America by the rewriting of our history, I think that it moves in the wrong direction. One of the reasons, you see, you can't have it both ways. You can't both say, which is what I believe, that for the most part women and lots of other people, including blacks and others, have been deprived of their place in American politics, and yet say that the chronicle of American political life must give those people equal space, because it is not true that there were no blacks, to my knowledge, in the Constitutional Convention.
But maybe we're defining...
And yet the Constitutional Convention was one of the great achievements of Western civilization.
Certainly.
So I think to minimize that achievement in order to maximize the role of people who were being deprived of opportunities is not to enlarge our sense of human nature.
Yes, the Constitutional Convention, of course, was a great achievement. On the other hand, it's only fairly recently that historians have devoted, I think, sufficient attention to the role of slavery in the Constitutional Convention debates, to the fact that for most African Americans, the Constitution and its adoption was actually a step backward, that it solidified the institution of slavery, it strengthened the institution of slavery, it gave slave owners greater political power than they had had. Now, what is the purpose of saying that? It's not to beat our breasts and say, oh, well, look at the evils in American history. It's to try to develop a nuanced, complicated view of history in which that our history is not just an onward and upward Whiggish progress. It's not a straight line of
just
onward
moving
progress.
up in a straight line. I mean, we've polished off Columbus. You are now saying that the founding fathers too are people we ought to look at with much greater scrutiny, and that they were they were not heroes necessarily.
I am not saying, as you suggested before, metaphorically, that founding fathers should be viewed as greedy, racist, bloods, whatever you said.
Right.
they were human beings with flaws and with greatness, and their achievements were human achievements.
But I think even if you look at traditional histories, whether they're traditional histories of Columbus, traditional histories of America, you find some of that ambivalence built into them. Certainly, if you go back and look at them, you'll see that the very questions that you're talking about are not quite given the prominence that they are. But even if there was a step backward in fact, in power relations after the Constitution, which I think we could all admit is kind of a debatable point, clearly the trajectory has been set for something that we all generally applaud now, that however much that document took a while to work itself out and to be extended to other people and awaits to be extended to other people living today, it's an important step in human history, not only in American history.
Yeah, let me just jump in here again. I mean, I don't think we should assume that because things did happen in a certain way, they were scheduled to happen in a certain way, that they had to happen in a certain way. Part of the reason that we made some progress, and I will certainly say that there was some progress, I mean, after all, we did bring slavery to an end in 1865, but part of the reason that we made some progress is because those people who were left out of that convention, I'm now talking about people who took part in the reform movements which ultimately led to the Civil War, which ultimately led to the end of slavery, because those people refused to be quiet.
May I just add that I think that to take a proportional representation approach to history seems to be misguided. If we're concerned with civilization and culture and the tradition of rights embodied in the common law and in our Constitution, we cannot apportion the role of people to people according to the number of them who exist. It's not a demographic question, it's a cultural question. And if we say, as I think most of us would agree, that for much of Western history, certain groups have been deprived of their opportunities, we can't also say that the story of Western culture must give them an equal position, because the great works of literature and painting and music and the arts in the West have been done by people who had the opportunity to do it.
I don't really think anyone is demanding proportional representation. I think what is the really subversive result of the new history, as I said before, is that it leads us to rethink open questions about some of these unquestioned achievements. Let us take the common law, for example. It does make us think differently about that great tradition of common law when we emphasize, as women's historians do nowadays, that under the common law women had no legal existence. They were subordinated into the legal standing of a father or a husband. Now, what is the purpose of saying that? It's not to say, look how bad the common law was. It's to say, if you're going to look at that legal tradition in its full implications for the whole of society, not just for some part of it, you have to put that at the center of your analysis, along with the rights and privileges which the common law also gives. It's a complicated situation. I think introducing complexity is what historians ought to be doing.
I think it's important that we not be utopians. And I think that one of the troubles with the feminist critique of the common law is that it assumes that the alternative to this rounded system, which deprived women of their opportunity to own property in certain circumstances and so on, the alternative to that is a perfect system in which everyone is equal to everyone else and everyone is
No, I think their point is not
in
that we ought to
peace.
have a perfect utopia. I think their point is that the very rights that we celebrate correctly and justly as the foundation of our constitutional definition of rights were founded in some respect on the deprivation of others' rights. If you add that into the equation, you get a much more interesting, I think, and complicated
That's
view.
a truism. That's not interesting at
It's
all.
a truism, but it's fully ignored in most studies of that subject.
Let me just ask something. About the United States of America. I mean, we talk now after the end of the Cold War. At least people like me talk about it. That there is an Americanization of the world going on. That has something to do with democracy and the market economy and individualism and tolerance and pluralism and civil liberties, the things we are most proud of, albeit in an imperfect society. That we are the #1 political, military, scientific, educational, linguistic, and economic power in the world at this moment. Quite remarkable. What on earth are we doing trashing ourselves?
This is not trashing. This is exactly what I think is wrong in this critique. We are not trashing the United States to point out the pros and cons. What you're asking for by posing it that way is to say we should celebrate. The role of the historian is to be the drumbeater, the celebrator of the nation state. In fact, one of the wonderful things about Professor Borstein's histories is that they are not confined to the nation state. The discoverers, for example, the world is becoming more international and more interdependent, and yet historians are still locked into the nation state as the premise of all our studies. We ought to be studying worldwide processes in which maybe the United States wouldn't look so unique in a way.
And let me make a point here, and that is that as historians, when we look at our culture, what we see is that not in 1994, but for the broad range of our history, we have been a multicultural, multiracial society. Now that means that we have been neither a European society nor an African society, but a blend of both those societies. And if you look in places like 18th century South Carolina, where the majority of people were Africans, people of African descent, and some people who had come directly from Africa, what you see is the unmistakable impact of Africa on America. When Europeans in the 19th century came to America to look around and see this new democracy, one of the things they recognized was how different America was from what they had known in Europe. And part of that difference was the fact that we were in part an African country too.
I think you're failing to take account of the fact that the great elements of our Western civilization are those which are mostly inherited from Europe. That includes the common law, it includes our language, our literature, our religions, and so on. So that the fact that there's no doubt about it, there were a lot of people who had come from other places and they were living their lives, and we should know about them as you're trying to help us learn, which I'm glad of. But what has built our culture and made us tolerant of one another, made it possible for us to sit here and talk together, which might not have been the case in Africa or elsewhere. What makes that possible is the high culture which we inherit, our European heritage, which is the heritage of civil rights, of the common law, of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and these are all transplanted.
I would have to argue, though, that there is something unique on American soil, that there is some richness and some carrying to a higher level of certain ideas that were present in Europe. It certainly had not existed. I mean, there's been a new experiment that began here, began later in France, and has really started a different moment in world history, which we could call sort of a democratic age.
But I have one last question. Who owns history? Does everybody own history?
Everybody, yes, does and is owning history. The people who made Gone with the Wind are presenting history. The people who are making television shows are making history.
We all own history. We all make history. It's just the traditional way in which history has been taught that leads us to believe that only famous people make history. But the fact of life is,
excuse me,
because that's who dominate the pages of most of our traditional
texts. This is a very American question: who owns history? As if it's a cultural property that whoever pays the highest, the highest advance for owns. I think that history owns us in a way. I mean, we have a responsibility to history to be as truthful, to reject as many false contemporary urges as we possibly can. We can see that Columbus was quite clearly idealized in 1892. I think we can quite clearly see that he was demonized in some unfair ways in 1992. And insofar as we care about the truth, which I think all people who study history ought to care about, it doesn't matter who owns it.
Every generation rewrites history so that it can make sense of its present. That's exactly what is happening now, and it's no different than what happened in the time of Jefferson when they were writing a history that would make sense for a new country.
Daniel Borstein, finish it off for us.
I think we've perhaps illustrated here today that perhaps the great value of history is in the seeking. And if we can seek together, that brings us together in spite of or because of all of our disagreements. And I've always thought that a free society is not an orderly one, not one with a new world order, but a society like ours of creative chaos. And we've been giving a little bit of that on this program, but that's encouraging to me.
Okay, thank you, Daniel Borstein, Eric Foner, Robert Royal, and James Horton. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our audience a great deal. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Suite 1050, Washington, D.C., 20036, or we can be reached by electronic mail at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.